Our next posture uses structural expansion to hit out. This looks like at first a kind of hammer fist strike straight out. Actually, we use it for lots of different things. It can be a hammer fist strike or it can be a chop straight out. We use it a lot in the knife curriculum, but it's mostly used for taking down a guard or hitting into a guard. And this is very much the principle that the power of a strike is very largely dependent on the target it's trying to hit or the thing that it's trying to achieve. Because this is nowhere near as powerful as the inside Buddha's Judgment strike, although it has got a slightly more pronounced striking edge, so the force transmission is a little bit higher, but still it's nowhere near as powerful. So sometimes people can be like, well, that's all woo, I see it against a punch bag, but actually some things don't look very powerful against a punch bag because that's not what it's for. Obviously, in Yiquan, one of the key things that we're interested in is stopping the opponent's attack, so having really good reactions, getting involved with either their guard or their punches, blocking, jamming, using little pats, parries and so on. And those techniques are not necessarily particularly powerful. They don't have to be powerful because we're only like pushing an arm or grabbing the guard and pulling it to one side, so we don't need a massive amount of force generation. What we need is really good structure and excellent timing, which you get through doing a lot of practice, a lot of live practice of course. Excellent timing, good structure, and then being able to move from that pat, that parry, that block, that guard breaking technique into something else. So after practicing the technique on its own, we then bring it into training drills or drills on the bag. This version's slightly different because it hits in and then it pushes, so it's a more advanced version of the same technique, so we start learning all these different variations. But people who don't do any live training get overconfident about these techniques. Actually, there's 1,000,001 counters to all of these, and a lot depends on the level of the people involved. So when I teach these, I always teach them with counters, and when you start adding in those counters, you start realising how vulnerable actually you can become. It's a very different story when people start seriously resisting. Next thing to say is that for all these postures there's always an A setting and a B setting, and it depends on the intention. If you want to strike and use gap farley, then that's usually what we call the A setting, and the B setting is usually if we want to hit someone and then push in that direction. And that's because if we want to hit with force, then we want to use a different kind of oppositional expansionary force, but if we want to push someone, we have to brace against the floor, so the posture has to change, and it will change which leg the posture is braced against. If you want to push against all of the opponent's weight, but you stack the posture to use gap, farley and expansionary force, you'll just push yourself away from the opponent. All of your force will be dissipated into pushing you backwards. So you have to stack it instead with the B setting, and that changes the way that the posture is rooted from the front foot. Changes to the back foot so that you can brace against it and push. It's a really simple, obvious law of physics. And it's overdetermined because, as well as making the structure stronger, you're not moving yourself away from the opponent, which you usually don't want to do if you're in some kind of stand-up grappling push hands. You don't usually want to push yourself away. It makes you much more vulnerable. You want to stay closer to the opponent and move in. And we'll come back to all of that another time. For the moment, we're focusing on the striking version, the gap farley versions. And something I'll come back to another time, but it's worth thinking about, is the sophistication of Bagua and the way that it uses the context. So have a think about this posture. Does it use open, close, rise or sink? And which way is it braced? Which way is it using the structure of the posture? It's a very sophisticated art, and it's not quite as simple or straightforward as it seems. Okay, so getting back to this posture, let's think a little bit about the rooting. And there are 3 variations again, so hitting down, hitting straight and hitting up, or 3 variations that we practice, and it uses a pivot root, and that changes slightly depending on the angle that we're hitting with. And recall the idea that the pivot root, or the toes of the pivot root, should only point towards the hit point. So if the movement itself is short, then the movement of the pivot root will also be short. And we can also note that for this movement, no amount of wind up or spiral phasing is going to help add power to the posture. It's just got to rely on explosive force. So we're not going to add in that little movement of close before we go into open. We're just going to go straight into open. And we're going to have to rely on screwing force and explosivity to add in the volume and power. And because it's such a short movement, timing is critical here. So the lead hand and the lead foot have got to move in exact unison. If they don't, then the moment of force transmission is lost because the posture is so fast. The hit point will have already hit before it sets back on the back leg. So everything's got to happen very fast and simultaneously. And we can compare that with the jab, which should have a phased movement. I know that some people do the Yiquan jab with the kind of pivot routing I've just demonstrated, but that is incorrect. It's scientifically incorrect because it doesn't allow the posture to set correctly. The jab routing phases and lags a little bit behind with the drop down on the punch, but this routing is simultaneous. Okay, now let's look at the difference between the hitting out version of this posture and the forearm push, which is a very different kind of posture. The forearm push is a much stronger posture, and that's entirely down to the difference between bone alignment and muscle alignment. So if you hit out with the edge of the hand, it's just common sense that the muscle alignment is quite weak. You can feel it if you hit a bag or push out like that, just push against the wall. Even if you manage to keep all those joints relatively tense, it just creates a big lever that pushes against the muscles that are holding the arm in place. Then by contrast, the forearm pushes at a point much closer to the elbow, so you have the bone alignment right down back into the shoulder, so it's just a much stronger posture. That also means it can transmit force a lot more easily. They both use open, but one uses a much bigger version of open with a much weaker muscle alignment, and the other uses a much shorter version of open with a much stronger bone alignment. And then secondly, to make the forearm strike work, you kind of move all your body weight forwards in one movement. Whereas for this posture, the oppositional force unfolds around the central axis, and you can start building that from micro movement, just feeling the way that the elbow goes back, the hand goes forward, and it feels like the posture is unfolding. It's a different use of open. And you can see here pretty clearly that with the inside forearm strike, all of your body is going in line with the posture, much like a hook, so the oppositional force is braced differently. Whereas with this posture, a lot of your body is going against the direction of the strike, so it's something people don't necessarily understand about oppositional force. There are lots of different kinds, and for example, in this case, it helps to generate force, but it doesn't help to transmit the force. It kind of mitigates against the transmission of force, so it becomes a little bit of a zero-sum game. A little bit, not completely. It adds volume and that adds power, but the most important quality it has is speed, and that gives it 1,000,001 different possible uses. Okay, so on the theme of oppositional force, when we change to the hitting down posture, interestingly, unlike the inside forearm strikes, when we hit down, we use rise. So we use 50% open, 50% rise. And you can see the posture here lifting up into rise. And it's mostly the same principle of adding volume into the posture. Such a small posture, adding volume. Such a small posture for a hit to generate the force for a hit. So using extra volume in the posture just adds that extra power, extra speed, extra power. And it's the kind of thing where you have to let intuition teach you, because I definitely see people doing forms where they do that posture but they use sync, and it looks ugly and it's not as powerful as doing it with expansionary force, i.e. open. And rise, don't forget, is also an expression of open because we're opening at the qua. But if you compare, for example, with bagua, usually bagua will be using sync with this posture, i.e. that's the intention when you do it in a form, because the idea is that you have your hands on someone, you're bracing on them, so you need to brace against them. So it's not the striking gap Farley, it's the brace Farley that's dominant in bagua. And in each one, that comes into play, for example, when we do push hands. So if we do this kind of posture in push hands, we use not only sink, but close. We switch everything the other way around. Okay, so again, there's an advantage in speed, and one of the advantages is we can use hit and flow. So remember, we hit and stop and then flow straight into another punch, take down the guard and then hit. And we practice that with all those hit and flow exercises we looked at in the beginner's course. And we can use hit and flow however we stack the posture, whether it's with close and sink or rise and open. Or indeed whether we use rear hand or lead hand, which I'm doing now, or hit with the rear hand and punch with the lead hand. There's 1,000,001 different variations. And then once again, exactly the same principle when we change to hitting up. Instead of using rise, we use sink. Seems counterintuitive, but when you see the posture, you can see how it creates volume. And just practicing the two together is a great way to just let your body intuitively feel the difference and why they're stacked like that. In which case you'll also feel that we're using that special case of close where it's the lead hip moving towards the back hip. So it's using sink and close. And that, as per usual, creates that strong compression set on the back leg. So overemphasizing there. You just use that lead foot to push up and feed into the compression set. And although it's pretty obvious, just watch carefully how the pivot root is perfectly in harmony with the posture. And also notice that this is release force in every direction. So every part of the body you can see is releasing force pretty much, but it's all skewed towards one point.